So today the subject is going to be multiculturalism, which is the third last subject we've got to cover this semester. And we've seen that a key part of most of the ideologies we've studied so far is that people should be free to live according to their tastes and preferences. That's the entire point of liberalism, that you have free choice. It's even the point of socialism, for example, is that people have the resources necessary to live the life that they want. Okay, so what this suggests is that people can live according to cultural traditions that they have. Now, in the previous lecture, we considered nationalism, which is an argument that nations are special and particular things, and that there's reason to value a specific nation more than others. Today we're going to look at multiculturalism, which suggests that multiple ethnicities, nationalities, and cultural traditions can exist within a single country and exist equally within a single country. Right, so to examine multiculturalism, we're going to need to separate different concepts that are used in debate about multiculturalism, like culture, race, ethnicity, and religion, and say, why are these things meaningful, why are they different from each other, that sort of thing. We'll look at some theories of multiculturalism, where different authors are trying to justify why multiculturalism is a good idea, but also what type of multiculturalism is a good idea. And lastly, we'll look at a feminist critique of multiculturalism briefly. It's not the only feminist critique you make, and it's not the only critique that is made of multiculturalism. But it's just to give you an example that not everybody agrees with this idea, and that some people will criticize it on different grounds. So, multiculturalism has a broad meaning, and it also has a specific meaning within political theory. And whenever we've got terms like this that have multiple different meanings, we need to be very careful about how we understand and define multiculturalism as it's used in political theory. So we can make a basic distinction between the way the word is used to describe an attitude, a tool of public policy, an aspect of institutional design, and a moral justification. And let's look at how this sort of plays out. So multiculturalism is an attitude, firstly, and people who agree with multiculturalism are usually described as either a multiculturalist or, more commonly, a cosmopolitan, somebody who believes that all of the different cultures are morally equal and that sort of thing. So multiculturalism as an attitude makes one of the two following arguments. Either that multiple cultures are a good thing, so it takes a positive stance on multiculturalism, or openness and tolerance. In other words, even if you disagree with some behaviors of a different culture to the one that you're part of, you respect their right to exist and their right to maintain their own traditions. In other words, you tolerate their existence. Multiculturalism can also be a tool of public policy. In other words, if a government is presiding over a diverse population, usually they have some discussion about, well, how do we manage the fact that we have diversity? Right, so rather than defining what multiculturalism is and saying whether it's a good thing or not, multicultural policy is simply developed on the basis of recognizing that there is diversity in the population. So for example, if you have lots of people from different language backgrounds, you could have a multicultural education policy. How do we manage the fact that we have to teach in a certain way, responding to the fact that the students are all different and stuff like that? Or multicultural health policy, so like in countries where there are minority groups, for example, there may be issues about whether minority groups seek health assistance, so do they go and visit a doctor more than other people or less than other people? Usually less, right? They're less likely to go and see a doctor because they don't trust the doctor or they don't feel able to connect with the doctor or that sort of thing. So they don't see the doctor. So usually the result of this is multicultural health policy. Just how do we encourage national minorities to access health services on an equal footing as the rest of the population? All right, so what we can see then is that public policy is being discussed in terms of how to include people from different cultures, but it's not trying to argue for or justify multiculturalism itself. And in this way, it's different from the theories that we're about to look at. So multiculturalism is also part of the way we design institutions. China is a super good example of that because many of the actual provinces of China are sort of designed as multicultural political institutions. In other words, national minorities are given specific bits of territory which belong to them and which are given relative autonomy within the overall framework of Chinese politics. So each of these reflects an ethnic group, and as such, the institutional design of China itself can be seen as a multicultural institutional design. That does not mean, however, that China adopts or supports the ideology of multiculturalism. You still have to decide whether, I'll present the theories to you in a minute, and you can decide whether you think that China supports or opposes multiculturalism, the idea. But in terms of the way the political institutions are designed, then certainly it's a multicultural institutional design. So, lastly, we have multiculturalism as a moral justification, and you should sort of have guessed by now that that's probably what we're focusing most on, right? Because this is political theory. And political theory is not necessarily about what currently exists, but what should exist, right? So institutions may exist that are multicultural in nature, but that doesn't mean that they exist for the right reasons. That doesn't mean they exist based on a moral reason. Now, political theory is concerned with what is justified, and when it comes to multiculturalism then, the question is, should multiculturalism exist? And if it does exist and should exist, what type of multiculturalism is the best type? Right, so all of the theories that we'll discuss today are basically trying to answer this question. So before we attempt to get to the bottom of this, we need to separate out some key concepts that are used in this debate about multiculturalism. We have culture, race or ethnicity, and religion. These are sometimes used interchangeably, which is bad because they actually have separate meanings and separate understandings. Even if they're overlapping, they should be seen as separate concepts. So, culture is an incredibly vague concept, right? And one of the biggest problems with arguments for multiculturalism is that they don't explain what culture actually is. So you think that culture is even in the word multiculturalism, right? And yet most people who argue for multiculturalism don't have a precise definition of what culture is, okay? Kymlicka is a famous professor who argues in favor of multiculturalism, right? He's like world famous. And yet, I would present the following sentence as probably one of the worst sentences a person could write. So this is like, if I had to explain to students how not to say things, I would use this sentence as an example of how you should not write, even though he's world famous and much more famous than me and all that stuff, right? This is an incredibly bad sentence, and hopefully you see why, okay? So he says, most countries are culturally diverse. According to recent estimates, the world's 184 independent states contain over 600 living language groups and 5,000 ethnic groups, right? That's quoted from his book. Now, if we look carefully at the statement, it contains a series of facts. They're all true, that's fine. But the sort of two sentences don't really tell us very much, because we come away from reading it and we're like, okay, so what makes diversity then? Is it the number of states that exist? Is it the number of languages that exist? Is it the number of ethnic groups that exist? We still don't know. So he spent 2 sentences discussing culture without actually defining culture. Right, and here's the biggest problem with most of this discussion around multiculturalism. So, is culture equal to language or ethnicity, or is it something separate, or is it a combination of these things? This guy is a world-famous theorist who speaks about multiculturalism, and we read his writing and we still don't know. Right? We don't have a convincing answer to the question. Okay, frustrating. Okay? And in popular and even in political discussion, culture is lumped together with other concepts like race, ethnicity, and religion. It's like as if it all means the same thing. Right? And even if we recognize that there are important connections between these concepts, right? There's overlap between these concepts maybe. Right? They're definitely not the same thing. The structure of a religious community, for example, and the structure of a linguistic community are very different. Okay, I'm not a Christian person anymore, but I was born into a Christian sort of environment, and in an English-speaking environment. And yet there's lots of English-speaking people who aren't Christians, and there's a lot of Christian people who aren't English-speaking. Right? So clearly it's not the same thing, right? Religion and culture and language are not the same thing, and should not be treated as overlapping concepts. Right? And yet people do. So if we want to understand culture in a scientific way, we turn to the discipline of anthropology, and we hope that we get good answers from anthropology. Right? The main reason anthropology exists is to answer the following question. If human beings are biologically the same, which they are, why do we have different cultures at all? Right? If we're all biologically the same, where does this cultural diversity come from? Right? So there's two basic answers to this, which we call universalism and relativism. Universalists, who typically, historically, have been Marxists or liberals, say that the reason we have different cultures is material. In other words, our experiences or our environment determine the culture in some way. So stuff like, oh, what does your economy look like? You know, do you grow things on farms, or are you a hunter-gatherer society, or do you have an industrial society, or stuff like that? Depending on what type of society you have, that shapes your culture in a lot of ways. You know, like for example, Hindu societies were agro-pastoralists. They depended on growing animals and stuff, and therefore they celebrate the existence of animals as a result. You know, they worshipped the cow because they had large herds of cows. That was their economic base. You know, that would be an example of a universalist explanation of a culture. The material basis of the culture creates the culture. Now, the alternative to this is relativism, which says that culture doesn't come from experience or material reality, it just is. It's a fixed and integral thing. It's like the sort of spiritual essence of the society that you're part of. It's not determined by experience or matter or the environment. It's a fixed thing. It's part of the essence of what your group is. Right? So, you know, first thing you have to decide is whether you're a universalist or a relativist, I suppose. Right, so moving on, we have race and ethnicity, and when we're talking about race and ethnicity, what we mean is the differences in the way people look or sound. More importantly, the way that we perceive other people to be different. Right, now, modern studies of race mostly are done in the area of sociology, and the primary reason for this is that race has no biological basis at all. Right, we're talking about genetic differences between peoples and stuff. It's like almost irrelevant differences that exist between peoples, right? So despite the fact that there's no biological basis for race, human attitudes and behaviors that result from this idea of race are very significant, in the sense that the racial group that you get born into has a huge impact on your life chances, right? How long you're going to live, how well you're going to live, what you're going to die of, you know, how rich or poor you're going to die, stuff like that, life chances, right? So sociologists argue that race has real effects and has become real because people see it as real. So because society believes that it's real, it ends up having real effects even if race itself is not real, right? Even if there's no biological reason to categorize people into different racial groups. Okay, so the primary difference between race and culture is that race is a relatively fixed concept, right? It's at least extremely difficult to change your physical appearance. You know, I don't know, like, it's impossible to avoid talking about Michael Jackson and this thing. Right? I don't know if you guys do, some of you know who Michael Jackson is, some of you don't, right? There's a pop music artist, famous in the United States, was an African American, remained African American until such time as he died, right? But changed his appearance in a very dramatic way, right? He transitioned from being black to white through a long and involved process of cosmetic surgery. I hope that demonstrates to you how difficult it is to change your appearance. Relatively speaking, culture is a much more fluid concept. You know, you can be part of another culture much more easily than you can be part of a different appearance group, I suppose, right? It's much easier to like learn a language. You guys have done it, right? You've learned the language to the extent that you understand me, right? That should be proof by itself that culture is much more fluid than race, You know, you can learn how to be part of a different culture or multiple different cultures. You can learn language, you can learn things that people believe, you can learn their customs and values and stuff like that. And these things might change over time as well. Like, I hope you don't believe by this time that Chinese culture has been the same forever. That it's never evolved or changed, right? It's part of this eternal fixed culture. If you believe that, it's a little scary, right? So cultures, people can not only change their attachment to different cultures and learn new cultures and stuff like that, but cultures themselves change over time and evolve. At least the ones that are successful evolve, right? So in addition to this is religion, and much discussion about multiculturalism relates to this relationship between religion and politics, and specifically around the question of, is it possible to have people with different belief systems coexist in the same political territory? Right, so historically, we should know that, you know, major wars have been fought all over the world over this question of people believe different things. We can't just allow that. You know, let's force those people to change their mind or invade them until they do. You know, that's the basis of much of world conquest is this idea, right? So, therefore, it's a legitimate question to ask. Are we really at a stage where we've matured to the extent that we can allow people with different belief systems in the same territory as us, right? Have we become that mature? Or is it inevitably going to produce social conflict? And this includes conflict between the idea of secularism. So secularism is where the state doesn't support any religion, and people who have religious belief. So if you're a true religious believer, can you exist within a secular state or not, right? And not everybody agrees that you can. So there's a theorist, Sharp, who identifies 4 different modes of religion. In other words, we're religious in 4 different basic ways. We have the existential mode, which is the faith that you have, you know, just the belief that you have, God either exists or it doesn't, and what type of God you believe in and that sort of thing. Second, we have the intellectual mode, which is when we believe in God, what impact does that have on the way that we think, on the beliefs that we hold, and how do we interact with the actual religious doctrine? So if you're a Christian person, the Bible is an actually existing thing. It's a set of ideas. You have to decide whether you accept them or not intellectually, as much as you decide whether you believe in God or not, right? Number 3 is the institutional mode, which is the bureaucratic structure of the religion itself. You know, so in Christianity, for example, the Catholic Church is a big, giant bureaucratic structure with a set of leaders, and you know, they have ranks and everything like that. You know, why do they have that? Because they're trying to be an authoritative institution, and they have to have a decision-making process about what is and isn't religious doctrine. Otherwise, everybody would just make up stuff by themselves, right? So they're trying to communicate one single idea, and to do that, they need one giant bureaucracy, right? And lastly, we have the ethical mode, which is how do we behave with people who believe the same things as us, and how do we behave with people who don't believe the same things as us? Do we treat those people differently, or do we treat them the same? How do we treat them differently if we do, right? So how do we behave with people who don't share the same beliefs as us? And we can see that religions, and within this, groups within individual religions, are different on the basis of how important each of these modes is to each individual religion, right? The priority they give to these things. So tension between religious groups, or between religious groups and non-believers, results from conflict in these modes, okay? We can see that in the existential mode, does a person's faith create difficulty for themselves or others in the society? You know, for example, if you're a Muslim in Macau, it's a very difficult society to live in, right? Why is that? Because, well, Islam teaches you you're not allowed to make personal profit out of gambling or usury, and you're not allowed to eat anything that's been contaminated by pork, by pig meat, basically. So there's 2 huge problems, right? The entire economy here is dominated by gambling. Even if you don't go in a casino, the economy still has gambling money pouring through it everywhere, right? And almost every cooking appliance in Macau has had pork touch it at some point, right? So 2 major problems. if you're a Muslim person. Your faith immediately contradicts the society that you're in here. It would be a very difficult place to live if you're that type of person. Right? Then we have the intellectual mode. So an example of this is when people go to school, we have to teach you stuff about science and stuff like that. Science is based on, or at least modern biological science is based on the theory of evolution. Now the theory of evolution contradicts certain major religious teachings, which say that the theory of evolution is wrong. Right? When Darwin's Origin of the Species was published, all of the major religions absolutely hated it and still hate it to this day. Right? Some examples of religions trying to make peace with evolutionary theory, but generally speaking, there's this big tension between the idea of evolution, as science teaches us, and the idea of creation, as many religions teach us. Right? So, which one do we teach as being correct becomes a big political issue. The institutional mode, so if the state wants you to do one thing, and if your religious leader wants you to do a different thing, who do you listen to? Who are you loyal to? And then the ethical mode. So do people from a particular religious group treat people differently based on whether that person is also part of that religious group or not? Right? Do we treat somebody less well, less positively, because they're not part of our religious group? So, having looked at these concepts, we'll now look at the theories of multiculturalism. And what we'll see in each of these theories is that they talk about human identity a lot. So, how does a person's attachments constitute what a person is and what a person values? What are the implications of this theory for personal freedom? And what are the implications of these theories for equality? Right, so, we'll see that each of these theorists says that multiculturalism is a good idea, but they say it for very different reasons, and they have a very different understanding of what they think multiculturalism should be. Right, so we start with Jeremy Waldron, who came up with this concept of hybridity. And hybrid is where we combine two things together and make a third different thing out of that combination. Right, so Waldron thinks that hybridity is a great idea. You know, when we have two people or multiple people from diverse cultures occupying one political space, Waldron says that this creates a bunch of new things. You've got new human beings, new cultures, new ideas, new politics, new movies, new songs, new everything, right? And that this is a good thing, right? He says this is part of what makes human beings dynamic, is that they can interact with each other and come up with new ideas and create social progress this way. Right, so Waldron isn't just arguing that we should tolerate outside people, he's saying that there's an active benefit that comes from interacting with different cultures. Right? There can only be benefit from this. So Waldron is arguing for a cosmopolitan version of multiculturalism. He's saying, well, all nations and cultures are equally morally significant, and every individual in those cultures will benefit from blending with other cultures. And this is a critique of both liberalism and conservatism. So against the liberals, Waldron is saying we should abandon this idea of autonomy. He's saying, well, nobody can be completely autonomous based on this toleration of difference. You know, that's not a good way of looking at the world, right? Instead, we should actively embrace the possibilities of multiculturalism. The world is more exciting, more interesting, and more beneficial if we interact with people from different cultures than if we just stay locked within our one single culture. Right? We're missing out on most of our potential. And against the communitarians, Waldron argues that, well, even if human beings need culture, they don't need to exist within a single culture. You can live within many different cultures at the same time and benefit from each of these cultures if you're smart. So one possible critique of Waldron is that his multiculturalism in practice creates social disharmony, in particular when smaller cultures interact with larger cultures. Now Waldron says, well, when small interacts with large, okay, each culture has an opportunity to influence the other culture. And you should know in practice that cultural erosion is a real trend. You know, especially the more interconnected our world becomes, the more smaller cultures interact with larger cultures. And this is not necessarily a positive interaction. You know, the 19th and 20th centuries were really good examples of times where lots of big cultures went all over the world, swallowing up and destroying smaller cultures, or at least causing lots of damage to them. You know? Now, it's probably not a concern for many of you. Chinese culture is very unlikely to disappear in the next 100 years, the next 500 years, or the next 1,000 years probably, right? It's very likely to exist simply because of the size and importance of China. But I want you to recognize that there's many cultures in the world that are small and vulnerable, who don't have many speakers left, or don't have many language speakers left, or where not many people practice the culture. Now, if this culture comes into contact with a big dominant culture, the impact is often that that culture disappears. You know, the young people get convinced that the way of the most people is better, or they stop practicing things, stop doing traditional things, and then eventually the culture ceases to exist. Now, Waldron's point of view about this is that this is just an acceptable consequence of social progress, right? When a culture erodes, if it becomes progressively weaker, if it fails to survive, his argument is that, well, this demonstrates that this culture is not as good as the one that replaced it. It's just the inevitable outcome of competition. You know, like when in the marketplace, two businesses compete and one goes bankrupt. It's as simple as that. Right? So Waldron is critical of models of multiculturalism that try to maintain these marginalized cultures. It's like, well, a culture has to exist on its own merit, not because of government support or something like that. You know, and if two cultures come into contact with each other and one ends up dominating the other, that's demonstrative proof that the smaller one wasn't as good. Okay, somebody who takes the opposite position is Kymlicka, author of that annoying quote that I showed you earlier. Now, he became famous for developing a framework of how do we give justice to small national minorities within a big majority framework. All right, so Kymlicka's theory basically says the problem with Rawls and most liberals is that they don't value culture and community enough. And he says that, well, we need to modify liberal theory to give emphasis to culture and community to an extent. Specifically because, well, if liberals are concerned with choice and think that choice is very important, it's an expression of freedom, culture is what allows people to make choice. It's the value framework that allows people to make the choices that they do. And what this implies is that individuals should have the right to cultural membership because it allows them to make more free choices. So what this suggests is that there is immediate priority given to cultures that are consistent with liberalism as against cultures that aren't. In addition to this, when Kymlicka wants to give people cultural rights, he says we should give them three sets of things. Firstly, self-government. So before we looked at China as an example of a country that gives certain national minorities self-government in a lot of areas of politics. Right? So power should be given to a political unit controlled by the ethnic minority. In other words, if you've got minority groups in your society, Kymlicka says give them as much opportunity to govern themselves as possible. That will make them as happy as possible. Right? That will give their culture the maximum power that they can have. Secondly, what's called the polyethnic, which is a weird way of saying government needs to spend money protecting minority cultures and developing them and making sure that they don't disappear. Right? So you can do that by funding the arts or funding tradition or making sure languages become written languages instead of just spoken languages, or there's lots of ways government can do policy to preserve small cultures. Right? So in addition to this, government should exempt minority groups from laws that go against their culture. Right? So in other words, you can have one set of law for the majority group and a different law for the minority group at the same time, and there's no problem with that. Okay, and lastly we have special representation. So here's the argument that minority groups should be represented in government and society, and that this representation should be protected by policy or law. So special effort needs to be given to make sure that minorities can see themselves in government, in society, in prominent positions, so that they feel included. So Kymlicka ends up in a sort of debate and criticism of what we we saw John Stuart Mill say about nationalism last week. If you remember that Mill argued a nation is not possible without a single language community, a single national language, and a single national culture, right? Kymlicka is pretty much the opposite of this. He's saying not only can you have multiple languages and cultures in a specific country, but you can even have multiple governments in a specific country. You can have parallel governments where national minorities govern themselves and the majority group governs themselves, and even separate legal systems where people govern each other differently according to that as well. Right? So it's unclear what this means for national unity, particularly because of the limited experience of this type of policy framework. Okay? Kymlicka's principles have been tried in very specific cases. You know, settler countries like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, where there's one huge super dominant majority group and some small minority groups, right? So even if you give tons of rights to the small minority groups, it has a meaningless effect on political stability, right? So where these ideas haven't been tried is countries like India or China with large minority groups numbering in the millions of people and stuff like that, right? So it's just never been attempted. So the question then is, can you have a national unity? I mean, Mill's question remains, I suppose. Can you have a unified nation while trying to give people autonomy and self-government at the same time? Right, it remains a valid question. Then we have James Tully, who basically says that modern constitutional government is a problem. All right, why does he think it's a problem? Well, he starts by saying that constitutional uniformity defines modern political theory. So Rawls and Kymlicka are good examples of that, where they believe that there should be like one constitution and laws and institutions that apply to all of the subjects. Now, Tully looks at modern constitutions and says they rest on ideas like sovereignty, regularity, uniformity. By contrast, if we look at ancient constitutions, they rejected all of these things, right? They rejected the idea of sovereignty, they rejected the idea of regularity, and they were pluralistic. In other words, they explicitly said different people should be subject to different laws, right? That different people have different laws. Now, Tully says that one of the biggest problems with colonialism was that it took foreign legal traditions and imposed them on societies where these traditions didn't exist, right? So, for example, they took the European tradition of constitutional uniformity and forced it on societies where that was never part of their political experience. Right? And the result of this is that sovereignty and uniformity would then impact and marginalize these other different cultures and displace them. Now, Tully's critical of modern constitutionalism, but he doesn't have any strong suggestions about what type of institutions could replace the modern constitution and respect cultural diversity in a modern context. I mean, he loves ancient constitutions, but it's really difficult to see how most ancient constitutions could work in our modern societies, right? So what type of institutional design would solve this problem? Tully doesn't really answer the question. And then we have John Rawls criticizing himself, right? So this is sort of why we should respect writers like John Rawls, because most people, you know, they write a book and publish something, and they never even think of criticizing themselves, right? Even if later you think you're wrong, you wouldn't actually go to the length of publishing a book saying, I was wrong, right? Rawls did this, and that's why even if you disagree with him, like, he deserves intellectual respect just for this alone, I think. So Rawls wrote a theory of justice in 1972, and then 21 years later, he thinks to himself, I probably was wrong about a lot of things, right? My experience of the last 2 decades has told me that I was wrong. Now I'm going to write a book about how I was wrong and criticize me. So what does he say? I mean, the biggest part of this criticism is that his earlier theory didn't account for the fact of reasonable pluralism, which is where two people can disagree with each other and be rational at the same time. Right? Most of liberalism rests on this assumption that logic equals one outcome, that rationality equals one thing. Right? And that there's this struggle between non-knowledge and knowledge, between tradition and rationality is going to progressively dominate tradition until such time as the whole world becomes rational. right? This is what we call positivism. Okay, so Rawls' argument for comprehensive liberalism is based on this idea that, well, principles of justice should be accessible to every rational person, and if a person is rational, they'll believe in one set of ideas. They will not disagree with each other. Rawls ends up arguing a very different position and ends up saying that reasonable people can do things like deny that human beings are autonomous, right? Say that people are completely influenced by culture, or deny that political values come from autonomy, right? So he ends up creating this sophisticated argument of how people can disagree with each other while remaining rational. So, Rawls says that there are lots of reasons rational people can disagree with each other. Firstly, because, I don't know, there's conflicting evidence, for example. You know, is something good or bad? And we look at, so some people will say that something is good and use evidence to prove why it's good, and some people will say it's bad and use the same evidence for why it's bad, right? So that doesn't make either people necessarily right or wrong. Evidence is conflicting, and sometimes people believe things based on conflicting or complex evidence, right? And sometimes people believe opposite things based on the same evidence. Secondly, we have different weights being applied to different consideration. Earlier in the semester, I asked you, is freedom more important or is equality more important? And we looked at a bunch of theories that argue either freedom or equality is more important, right? Now, there's no empirical reason, evidence reason, to say that freedom or equality is more important. This more or less is an epistemological question. It comes from what you believe about where knowledge comes from, or about what values are more important, or stuff like that. Yeah, so then we have vague concepts. So today we're studying a very vague concept. Culture is an extremely vague concept. It's not well defined. Even people who specialize in studying it don't define it very well. We've seen that, right? So if you've ever had an argument with somebody where you argue with them for like 2 hours, and then at the end of the argument you realize you were talking about completely different things. It's an incredibly frustrating experience, but it's usually the result of a vague concept. You think you're talking about the same thing, you're not, so you end up arguing beyond each other like that, and your argument doesn't touch each other's opinion. Right? And then we have conflicts between different moral considerations. A good example of this is like, you know, psychologists like asking these annoying questions like, you know, your wife and your mother fall off the side of a boat and you can only save one from drowning. Which one do you save? You know, and you're like forced into making a decision that's both right and wrong at the same time. You know, because if your wife falls off the side of the boat and you save her, nobody's going to say you're a bad person, right? You did a good thing, you saved her. If your mother falls off the side of the boat by herself and you save her, right? Nobody's going to say that's bad. You did a good thing. You saved her. Now, if they both fall off and you make a